Greetings, friends. Yesterday, negotiations between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations did take place in Istanbul. At first, I doubted that the Russians would even go to these talks after the recent events. But no, they decided to humiliate themselves to the very end. The negotiations were attended by practically the same delegations as last time. And, as expected, they did not yield any significant progress, except for the fact that we are now waiting for an exchange of prisoners and an exchange of the bodies of fallen servicemen. Pay special attention to the Russian faces. I think the context of those events that took place on the eve of the negotiations in Istanbul is very important, because everything was written on the Russians' faces. You might ask, so why did the Russians even bother to fly there and humiliate themselves if it was obvious that there would be no significant progress on the issue of the Russian-Ukrainian war? And if before that they had already taken some serious hits to their strategic aviation? The answer is simple. I've said this more than once already. The Russians are stalling for time and putting on a show for a single audience member, Donald Trump, so that he will eventually withdraw from any involvement in the issue of the Russian-Ukrainian war altogether.
That the United States will just simply wash their hands of it and say, you cooked up this childish mess together with President Biden, so you will have to deal with it yourselves.
For now, I need to remind you that we have a major fundraising campaign with Monobank for drones, including those for intercepting Shaheds. Be sure to join in and, of course, make sure to subscribe to my channel if for some reason you haven't done so yet. As expected, there was no ceasefire after the talks in Istanbul. Ukraine, the United States of America, and European partners proposed an unconditional ceasefire for 30 days. The Russians once again rejected this idea in Istanbul and instead proposed a ceasefire for 2 or 3 days, and only on certain sections of the front.
We specifically proposed a comprehensive ceasefire for a period of 2 or 3 days on certain particular sections of the extensive front lines.
Well, of course, that means nothing. The Russians have already announced a 1-day ceasefire. Then they announced a 3-day ceasefire along the entire front, and yet across the entire front they continue to advance and attack Ukrainian positions. So their proposal yesterday is just nonsense.
As they said about the ceasefire, they're ready for a ceasefire for 2 or 3 days to collect the dead from the battlefield. I think they're idiots, because in principle, a ceasefire is meant so that there are no dead.
In reality, the Russians have no intention of observing any truce, and they don't actually need any truce at all. Once again, they're just stalling for time, and to do so, they didn't show the Ukrainian side their version of the memorandum and only provided it during the negotiations in Istanbul. We are now going to discuss the Russian version of the memorandum, but first we need to talk about the Ukrainian one. Its main points are as follows: a complete and unconditional ceasefire on all fronts as a prerequisite for peace. We have already talked about this more than once before, and both our European and American partners have emphasized it as well. Humanitarian measures, the return of children, exchange of all prisoners, release of civilians, prevention of renewed aggression, international security guarantees, involvement of the international community in further settlement, and Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine has the right to be part of the Euro-Atlantic community without restrictions regarding NATO and the European Union. Territorial issues. The territories of Ukraine seized by the Russians since 2014 are not recognized by the international community as Russian. Territorial matters are discussed only after a complete ceasefire. Sanctions against the so-called Russia may be gradually lifted, but with a rapid reinstatement mechanism if the so-called Russia violates the agreements, which of course it will. And the frozen assets of the so-called Russian Federation will be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine or will remain frozen until reparations are paid. But the key point, as before, for any substantive negotiations to even take place is a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, which the Russians refuse to accept. Now let's talk about the Russian version of the memorandum. Nothing new. The Russians have essentially issued an ultimatum to Ukraine. We are supposed to recognize that Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions are parts of the so-called Russian Federation. We are supposed to withdraw our troops from the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine is to be prohibited from joining any military alliances or coalitions. It is necessary to disband nationalist formations on the territory of Ukraine and, of course, to grant the Russian language official status. In other words, these are absolutely unacceptable conditions for Ukraine, and the Russians, knowing that they are unacceptable, prepared such a memorandum for that very reason. But there is something positive. First of all, there is to be a prisoner exchange. Ukraine and the so-called Russian Federation will exchange all severely wounded prisoners of war and all prisoners of war aged 18 to 25. The Russians have also promised to return 6,000 bodies of Ukrainian defenders, or so they say.
Next week, they will hand over these bodies to the Ukrainian side so that they can give them a proper burial. I don't know if there are any on our side, if they have any.
Our side, in turn, is also ready to hand over 6,000 bodies of Russian occupiers to the so-called Russian Federation. But regarding the bodies that the Russians might hand over to us, there could be some nuances.
The Russians have also stated that they are ready to hand over the bodies of our fallen soldiers, 6,000. Our side has agreed to hand over 6,000 Russian bodies to the Russian side. But here it is very important to study this issue carefully. I mentioned this to Defense Minister Umerov. Why? Because, as was said, as we have learned, out of these 6,000, the Russians are missing 15 identified bodies.
These are probably all the truly substantive results of yesterday's negotiations in Istanbul. As for ending the Russian-Ukrainian war or even reaching a truce, there is probably nothing left to comment on here. The Russians have said it all themselves.
We don't need a truce. We don't need peace for, say, 30 days, 60, 70, 85. It doesn't matter how many.
Apparently, the Americans will indeed have to impose sanctions against the so-called Russia. But don't think that Trump can do this. Most likely he'll just ignore it. But the Senate can do it, and the House of Representatives isn't against it either. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, after these so-called negotiations in Istanbul, stated that there are many members of Congress who want us to sanction Russia as strongly as possible. And I support this. But the President of the United States, Trump, remains silent. So far, he hasn't commented on the Ukrainian attack on Russian strategic aviation, nor has he commented on the negotiations. Maybe that's for the best.
What is the President's reaction to this Ukrainian drone attack, this incredible strike on Russian air bases? I'm sure he saw it. What is his reaction?
The reaction is this war must end.
Even now, the Russians themselves can't believe what happened. They're trying to find excuses for this situation or are simply making up laughable versions. They say those were non-operational planes anyway, subsidized, and they weren't needed.
They were weighed down with tires, maybe not because they were supposedly being protected from something, but simply because they were empty. They were literally just mock-ups so that they could be taken away.
Some propagandists are still thrilled by the Ukrainian operation and are eagerly awaiting a movie about it.
I don't know, but films and books will be made about this operation.
Meanwhile, Gherkin's friends keep crying. They just can't understand how this could happen. How was it possible that Ukraine attacked Russian strategic aviation and the very next day the Russians went to negotiations? This is some kind of kakostvo, as this gentleman put it.
Actually, going to Istanbul on the 2nd, for negotiations on the 2nd of June, well, it was kind of, inappropriate. How do you say cuckold in English? Cuckold. Not cuckold, cuckold. It's pronounced with an A. What kind of spinelessness is this?
His conclusions are disappointing. The propagandist is so demoralized by the Ukrainian attack that he believes the so-called Russian Federation is inevitably heading toward defeat.
I believe that as a result of Operation Web, we are facing a danger even greater than under Brezh, so to speak. The prospect of our defeat in the war. Yes, you heard that right.
Honestly, in my eyes, our chair has become shaky. It's really wobbled.
If only we had their optimism, but I still believe that we friends will live to see the so-called Russian Federation begin to fall apart. Dreams are dreams, of course it's nice, but it's better to talk about something concrete. Let me remind you about the fundraiser. Together with Monobank, we are raising 70 million hryvnias to purchase 220 Shahed interceptors and another 1,500 regular anti-aircraft FPV drones. Help protect the Ukrainian sky and join in. All the details are in the description of this video. And also, for a donation of 300 hryvnias or more, you have a chance to win an apartment in Kyiv in Pechersk. It's a great investment. Meanwhile, thanks to you, we continue to deliver drones to the front every day. And in the past day, our soldiers received another 315 new FPV drones. Glory to the heroes! Friends, the so-called Russian Federation is in for many more unpleasant surprises, but we won't be making any announcements. It's better to keep supporting Ukraine's security and defense forces.